Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you the definitive review of the Tamron 20mm F2.8 DI3, which means it's for mirrorless OSD, which is the optimized silent drive focus motor, and then it's M1:2, which means it has a 1:2 magnification or a 0.50 times, what we might also call half-life size, a very, very useful figure. Now, if you are looking more for a quicker, less detail-oriented review, at the end of this week I'll be releasing kind of the conventional review that hits the highlights and gives a little bit less detail, so stay tuned for that. Here today, however, we're going to break everything down in a little bit deeper detail, and so particularly if you're considering purchasing this lens, it will be able to give you a more informed ability to make that choice. Now, the 20mm F2.8, which is given an internal code of F050 by Tamron, it is the third of the series of the 20mm, 24mm, and 35mm. And we've already reviewed both the 24 and the 35mm lenses. And if you take a look at my channel, you can see the reviews of those. This lens, they took a little bit longer with in development, but I think that probably many of you share my perspective that this is the one that I was most interested in getting on my hands on, because as far as focal lengths go, 20mm is a very, very useful focal length, whether you're shooting stills, landscapes, for example, whether if you're wanting a lens to use for vlogging or for general video purpose. 20mm is a very flexible focal length, and so one that I'm sure a lot of us were very interested in. And so today we're going to break it down by starting first by taking a look at the handling of the lens. And while it's very, very similar to the other two, perhaps you haven't been watching those videos. So let's take a quick hands-on look at what you are getting here in this compact little prime lens. So first of all, this ought to look pretty familiar to us after this being the third lens in this series that we've taken a look at. So the 20mm F2.8, in many ways, I think it is probably the biggest beneficiary of the design language here, in that for a 20mm, which is probably it's definitely the most demanding focal length that they have accomplished here, the physical size is actually quite moderate for this kind of focal length and aperture combination. And so I think that in many cases you could have a much larger lens than this. For example, I've reviewed either the Zeiss Milvus or the Zeiss Classic 21mm F2.8, and it is obviously considerably physically larger than this. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got the Loxia 21mm F2.8 that is a little bit smaller than this, but of course you're getting autofocus here with this lens as well. So to give you just kind of an idea of the physical size here, we'll pull that off. And so this obviously is the tiny option here, and that is the Samyang AF 18mm F2.8 that I reviewed not long ago. And so it's obviously much narrower in diameter. 67mm filter thread, which is shared by all of Tamron's FE designs. In this case, you've got a 58mm filter thread, and comparatively to, when you put the lens hoods on here, not that the lens hood is particularly large on this lens, it's a relatively compact, but you can see that the width is definitely noticeable here. Just to give you an idea of those specs, 145 grams for the Samyang, 221 grams for the Tamron. So it's still very light, but not as light as what the Samyang is. And in terms of that diameter, the Tamron is 2.87 inches or 73 millimeters compared to 2.5 inches or 63.5 millimeters for the Samyang. And so you've got a definite difference in size. Now, another lens that definitely should be cross-shopped here is Tamron's own 17 to 28mm F2.8 zoom lens. And we will do some optical comparisons there as well. And so you can see that obviously the zoom lens is larger, but it's quite a compact lens for covering this kind of focal length with a maximum aperture of f2.8. And so it's well worth consideration here as well, particularly since it has the more sophisticated RXD focus motor instead of the OSD focus motor. So this comes in at 420 grams, so it's about 200 grams heavier. and it is overall 2.87 inches in diameter. So exact same diameter, and they share the same filter thread size as noted previously. The biggest difference obviously is going to be in the length of the two lenses, whereas the prime lens is only 63.5 millimeters in length. The zoom is 99 millimeters in length. And so, there is some difference there, but, it's not massive. So what we've got here is we've got a gasket here at the lens mount. We do have flooring coating on that front element, and some internal sealing. So we've got a weather sealed design, primarily a engineered plastics outer shell here, and so nothing particularly special, but nothing bad about it as well. It's going to be, I think, going to wear fairly well. We've got a reasonably damped focus ring here. We'll throw it back on the camera. This is focused by wire, and so as in all of these situations, you have to put it into a manual focus mode, and then you actually do your manual focus through using this. Now, I will note there is some lag in the manual focus. I'm going to turn this and so you can maybe see what I'm talking about. That as I go to focus, nothing is happening all the time. It's as if periodically there's a little bit of a jump instead of a smooth. And so it isn't a great manual focus here, and it could use some tweaking. I mean, you can get the job done, but rather than it being a nice linear amount of movement, it's instead like little jumps along the way. And so I don't love the manual focus ring, which is, probably not surprising because I don't necessarily love this focus motor in general. OSD is not my favorite. It's my least favorite probably of Tamron's current design when it comes to this. But at the same time, it gets the job done. It's just a little bit slower and a little bit coarser in action than their better motors. But anyway, moving beyond that, you've got 10 elements in 9 groups in the optical design. You've got 7 rounded aperture blades. Then, of course, the big ticket item that sets this 20mm apart from any other of these lenses is that it does have the 1:2 magnification. And so that's obviously a huge deal that we'll examine more in our optical segment. But I do want to point out one final thing on that, and that is that our minimum focus distance here is 4.3 inches or 10.92 centimeters. Now, that's not from here, however, that's from this mark right here. It's measured from the sensor itself. Remember that the lens itself is 63.5 millimeters long, and you add in probably another 10 millimeters, and so you're only left with about this much room in front of the lens, not really even enough room to have the lens hood on at your minimum focus distance. However, performance at minimum focus distance is quite good. So as noted before, while it is, kind of more of a consumer grade type build, engineered plastics, nothing feels particular fancy here, but what we do get is a fairly nice weather sealing package here with the gasket at the lens mount, flooring coating on the front, and some internal seals to make sure that we get, some protection when we're out using the camera and lens. And so that certainly is an upside. I think in many ways the design is less compromised here in terms of its physical size. No, it's not as small as we saw as the Samyang. However, at the 20mm focal length, that's, this is really still quite a compact lens for the focal length and aperture combination. Now, the OSD in the name refers to Tamron's optimized silent drive focus motor. And of the 2 motors that it's employing in these Sony FE lenses, including also the RXD. RXD is what's been in the zoom lenses so far, and I vastly prefer the RXD motor to this OSD. For one thing, the RXD motor is quieter, it's faster, it seems to have more torque, and so focus happens more quickly, and it's also just smoother in operation. And so as we can see here, you are going to encounter some noise when doing focus pulls. It comes in the form of somewhat of a clicking sound. Let's take a look at it. And so, of course, I would prefer less sound during focus, and as you can see from some of these other videos, the other thing that I see happen with these OSD motors is that because there is a little bit of noise, If the lens doesn't completely settle in focus and it makes kind of minor adjustments, you will hear more of that clicking through the onboard audio. Now, obviously, that's not a factor if you're recording your audio separately from that, or if you're in a situation where there's more environmental noise. But there are going to be circumstances excluding, those kind of parameters where you are going to hear some noise. And so I'm not in love with that. What is good, however, here is that I feel like the focus speed is, maybe a little bit faster than what I saw. It seemed like the 20mm, because of probably the nature of the focal length, focus distance between focus points is smaller with a wide-angle lens, more tends to be in focus. And so as a byproduct of that, I found focus speed faster with this compared to the 24mm, the 24mm being faster still than the 35mm. And so I don't really consider focus speed to be an issue here. Focus, as you can see here, is happening fairly quickly. But the other positive thing that we did see is that I found that focus accuracy was actually quite good. We'll take a look at a quick segment when it comes to that. So here for PET IAF, we can see that it's locked onto the eye using the PET IAF, and we've gotten very good crisp results there with appropriate focus. Here in fairly low light conditions, particularly where the subject is, we can see that, wow, the picture is at a fairly low shutter speed, and so there's a little bit of motion blur. You can see that focus is accurate here on the forward eye. This isn't really a very good lens for this kind of shot. It's too close and too wide a focal length. However, I had my wife, just shoot a series of photos like this just to see if it was getting accurate IAF. And since I knew it would produce a somewhat awkward looking end result, I volunteered myself, since you've all seen me look awkward before. But you can see once again, and consistently throughout about 9 or 10 frames, we got consistently well-focused results on the eye itself. Finally, another kind of practical test that I often find is with near objects and to see if it will grab onto those. And as you can see here, focus has done a nice job of grabbing what I was looking for, which is this, whatever it is. I don't actually know, but it has kind of a very unique form and shape. And so I like when I see them out in nature. And you can see that we've gotten crisp results and we have got well-focused results. So overall, autofocus was a positive in terms of autofocus accuracy. And so as we saw for both pets and humans, IAF works fine. Do recognize, however, with a wider focal length like this, that's going to be limited by the distance to the subject. If you are too far away from your subject, the eye doesn't occupy a large enough portion of the frame for it to actually sense and track an eye. And so as the nature of that, wide-angle lenses tend to lose the eye more quickly if you're further away. The upside, kind of the trade-off, is that because depth of field is so much deeper, it doesn't really often make too much of a difference in real-world circumstances because everything's going to be basically in focus anyway. And so anyway, just be aware of that limitation. It has nothing to do with Tamron. It's true of any wide-angle lens. It's just the nature of the beast. But overall, as you can see from these video clips, obviously the autofocus gets the job done, and we can see that if you eliminate the sound from the equation, the focus pulls are smooth enough and the footage looks great, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few moments. But overall, I would say that you get a useful lens, certainly, and as we can see, it works fine for vlogging as well if you eliminate that little bit of clicking noise from the autofocus. Now, the biggest thing that most people are interested in, of course, is how does it perform when it comes to the image quality? The answer is a little bit complicated. Overall, it does most things very well. However, there is one fairly fatal flaw for some shooters that we'll have to take a look at. Let's jump in and let's take a closer look at the image quality performance from the Tamron 20mm F2.8. So as mentioned, the Tamron 20mm F2.8 has one serious flaw, and that is that it has a huge amount of barrel distortion. Not a small amount, but a fairly massive amount of barrel distortion. Unfortunately, at the moment, there isn't yet a profile for the lens. In fact, these Tamron Sony mount lenses have been somewhat slow to get profiles. There is one now for the 28 to 75, but so far not even the 17 to 28, and certainly none of these new primes have a profile. And so you can see there is a tiny bit of a wave pattern to the distortion. That's not such a big deal, but you can definitely see, even despite my best efforts manually, there is some barrel distortion left behind. A little bit better result if you compare the JPEG here. And it's not perfect, however, it is, again, it's fairly well. So when I first did kind of the standard test, I thought, wow, that's a terrible result. Hopefully it won't be that bad out in, you know, kind of more appropriate real world distances, not so close as to a test chart. I was surprised to see, in part surprised, because the viewfinder is automatically corrected. And so when I took the shot, I thought, you know, it's not so bad out in the real world. Then I got home and looked at the uncorrected image on my computer. It's like, wow, that is a lot of barrel distortion, still at a distance of about 15 feet, you know, 4 meters or so there. Furthermore, if you take it out to infinity, it still remains. You can see some barrel distortion, a bulge there on the horizon line. And this is in a composition, while it's not perfectly centered, it's, you know, it's like rule of thirds, and so definitely not right near the limits. So if you employ just a manual correction in Lightroom here, you can see it's not perfect, but you can see how much correction is taking place. And so this, I mean, you're certainly going to lose some focal length trying to correct for this distortion in real world work. So in this comparison here, you can see what's left after I have constrained cropped that image that we just looked at down. And here is a look at how the corrected JPEG out of camera looks like. And so in both cases, you can see there is this slight bulge there on the horizon line. And so, I mean, if straight lines are in your shot, there's definitely some issues to work through here. There's no doubt about that. You can see that the profile in camera manages to spare a little tiny bit more of the image than what does a manual correction. And so a slight advantage there. Here's another couple of images right out of camera that are JPEGs. And so you can see in this shot, horizon line looks fine. I don't think you would notice this if I wasn't, you know, talking about it right now. Likewise, in this shot here, the horizon line, if you put a ruler on it, is probably not perfect, but it's straight enough that I don't think you would really notice. And you know, what is worth noticing is that there's a beautiful amount of detail across the frame on this shot. So we're going to get to more positives in a moment, but definitely this distortion is a serious issue. Now, if you can compare this to the Samyang AF 18mm, you can see that the Samyang has considerably less distortion, even though it is a wider focal length. The Samyang's kind of weakness here is you can see that the vignette, it doesn't create kind of an even pattern in terms of coloration. You can see with the Tamron that you're getting some darkening in the edges. With the Samyang, you actually see a little bit of discoloration in the vignette area. And so, I mean, there's some trade-offs there. Now, in this particular comparison, the prime definitely loses to the zoom lens. This is the 17 to 28 millimeter at 20 millimeters. You can see at this point that it has very little distortion, and it also has less vignette by comparison. So here's a quick look at my test chart, and then after some corrections that I've done, and then one final option is if we look at the JPEG, and the JPEG is obviously a little bit cleaner looking in general. So we're going to use that for our test. Take a look at resolution based on this chart. Kind of, we've already examined those other flaws fairly thoroughly, so this will allow us to focus in on the resolution. So what we can see is that we have got fairly good resolution at f2.8 in the center of the frame. Everything looks fairly crisp here. Pretty good contrast as we move off mid-frame. The same is true, and as we move towards a corner, you can see a little bit of softness here towards the very edge, just mostly a loss of contrast, but overall everything is holding up fairly well. Now, if we compare to the Samyang in terms of the resolution here, we can see that the Tamron exhibits a little bit more contrast here in the center of the frame. Moving off here towards the edge, you can definitely see that there's higher contrast on the Tamron versus the Samyang, which is getting a little bit softer there, less contrast. And if you move towards the corner, you see that continues to be true with the resolution pattern, definitely extending a little bit further into the corner on the Tamron than it does on the Samyang. This image really stood out to me at a closer focus distance, but look at how crisp and nicely delineated the detail is on this. That was a very impressive looking result, on a 42 megapixel image sensor. Now, if you compare f2.8 to f4, we definitely see f4 has improved in terms of the contrast, both the lettering and then the contrast in the sails here looks crisper at center of the frame. If we move towards the middle of the frame, you can definitely see more crisp detail on the back of this $2 bill here. And finally off into the corner. The corner is not only brighter, but you can see much higher resolution here. And you can see that now moving off towards the extreme corner, everything is looking nice and crisp. Stopping on down to f5.6, you see the corner is brighter yet, and contrast and resolution is crisper yet. And so a very nice result. If we pop back to the center here, we see the center looks really fantastic at this landscape type aperture. So taking a look at kind of real world landscape images here at landscape aperture, we see nice detail here all across the frame, good drawing here, nice color. And we can see if we look up into the extreme corner here, once again, we can see that lateral chromatic aberrations are quite well controlled and no green and purple fringing that's really popping out too much there. Here's another image where our focus point is up here, and if we look ahead, we can see there's great detail. And if we look up in here, look how nice the kind of the delineation between the dark moving on to the bright sky. Everything is resolving nice and crisp. The other thing worth noting here is that where you don't have straight lines that are so much an issue, you don't really notice the distortion to the same degree. Here at more of a medium distance to the subject, we can see that we've got very good color, and you can see great contrast and detail. It's a shame that the distortion is so strong, because in so many other areas, the resolution of the lens is really, really good. Now, the tough comparison is if you look at the excellent 17 to 28 millimeter zoom from Tamron at f2.8 and at 20 millimeters. In many ways, Tamron has created its highest competition with these zoom lenses, and as you can see, it definitely has a brighter, higher resolution, crisper looking result in the center of the frame at f2.8. You can see the same is true mid-frame. And finally, if we move off into the corner, you can see that there's definitely an improvement for the zoom in the corner as well. So if we could compare these two at f5.6, we find that there's not as much of a difference there. I do think that the zoom lens continues to have a little bit better just kind of rendering acutance maybe of the fine details. If we look here into the corner, you can see on the bill that there is a little bit more fine detail that is rendered there, but they are more similar than different here at this point. Now, obviously, with a 20 millimeter lens with a maximum aperture of f2.8, there's only going to be so many opportunities to create bokeh, but what we can see here is that we've got a nice crisp result on our actual point of detail, and good, again, good delineation of the edges, and the bokeh looks reasonably soft here. Here's another example that I like. We can see good detail on our line of focus, and we can see that the background looks quite nice here. So how about in Coma performance? Really, really good news in the sense that I think the star points are particularly crisp looking here, and so that is a plus. If we move off towards the edges, we can see a little bit of Coma that starts to pop up. You can see just a little bit of changing of shape and wings. I've seen a lot of worse performances. I've seen some better as well. And so I would say this is better than average, but it's not exceptional in that regard. So of course, what sets this lens apart is the fact that it does have a 1:2 maximum magnification. As you can see here, that allows, on that bill that we saw earlier, it allows you to get really, really close. And if we look in at a pixel level, there is a lot of detail that is rendered there. Now, because the plane of focus is not super flat, it's not going to replace a true macro lens, in that a macro lens should have kind of equal sharpness for the most part, across the frame. That's not going to happen with a lens like this, and so you do have to compose and recognize that you're going to have sharpness at one point and not necessarily throughout the rest of the image. But I am impressed by how great the detail is rendered there in this image at macro distances. And so here, just give you an example of more of a real world shot. And so, you know, I've gotten very close here to these grapes. It allows you again to look at some of the bokeh, and it kind of gives you an idea of how you might use this lens, maybe for some food photography or to kind of tell a story. Here's another example where I've gotten, you know, this is basically maximum magnification here. And so you can see, stop down a little bit. Depth of field is still quite thin, but you can see it's rendered the fine details very well. Now I did want to show this. This is actually the exact same setup. And what I've done is this is shot in full frame. This, I used APS-C mode on the A7R Mark III. And so it just goes to show that if you're using the lens on an APS-C camera, you can get a more, you know, a higher apparent magnification, even though that's not technically true, but the crop factor is going to make it appear so at a global level. Now, obviously, if we look at a pixel level, that's not actually true, is it? They both show the same amount of detail, same magnification, but this is what you're going to see on APS-C, and so it's worth considering. Now finally, we'll end with what I consider to be the standout here, and that is that the B-bar coatings on this lens are exceptionally good for flare resistance. You can't really tell it from this image, but the sun was exceptionally bright here in this shot and located right here. You can see, however, that contrast is held up. There is no ghosting artifact that I can see. Even more surprising is when I stop down. This is at f11, and you'll see that is as much of ghosting that I could introduce into the image, which is really, really exceptional. Here's another example here. And so you can see some of the blades coming off of that. And so it's a 7 aperture blade, so a 14-point sunburst. You can see, however, contrast is held up exceptionally. And that's true for video as well. And this is one of the best video performances I've seen. Usually panning across the wide open here, you would definitely see some flare and ghosting. And then stop down, it would be even more apparent. This lens really does an amazing job in its flare resistance. So you can see it does have just one major flaw, but it is a doozy, unfortunately. That barrel distortion is significant, and it's exaggerated at the moment by the fact that if you're a raw shooter, you have limited options for correction outside of manual correction, and maybe you're not confident in doing that. And so you may be stuck waiting for the profile to arrive. And unfortunately, that's been a little bit slower a process than what I would at least personally prefer. And I'm still waiting for a profile for the 17 to 28 millimeter, which I reviewed last summer. And so unfortunately, that's not arriving all that quickly. And so if you are a JPEG or a video shooter, not such a big deal. It's corrected fairly well for either of those mediums, and so not really a problem. But if you are a raw shooter like myself, there are going to be a lot of situations where you're going to get a less than desirable result that's going to take some post-processing work to correct for. On the extreme plus side, I don't know that I've ever seen a better flare resistance performance than what I saw from this lens. I'm very, very impressed for that. And in many ways, I think that makes it more attractive maybe to those who are video shooters. The fact that you have such amazing flare resistance allows you to do some things with this lens that you frankly couldn't do with some other lenses as a result of that. And so in conclusion, I think at the end of the day, if you're looking at some direct competitors, this Samyang 18mm F2.8, it has fewer flaws. And maybe its strengths are not quite as exaggerated as well. It isn't quite as sharp as the Tamron. It doesn't have that, macro capability. In fact, it has a very low magnification factor. And, it doesn't have weather sealing. It also doesn't have the extremely good, flare resistance. It's not bad, but it's not anywhere near what the Tamron is when it comes to that. And so, there are pros and cons, and maybe you need to decide what lens works best for your purposes, what strengths best suit your needs, what liabilities you can live with. If you've got a little bit more of a budget, however, I think that Tamron has given you probably the best alternative to their own prime lens in the form of the 17 to 28mm F2.8 RXD prime. It has got a similar degree of build. It has got faster, smoother, better autofocus. As we saw, it's at 20 millimeters. It is a bit sharper. It does pretty much everything outside of flare resistance. It does just about everything a little bit better. And of course, it gives you the flexibility of the 17 to 28 millimeter zoom focal length. And so it gives you some options there. Now, as far as the size goes, it's still a moderately sized lens. I think that most people that have used it as a zoom lens would agree it's not really a limiting principle, the size of it and the weight of it. It's all very reasonable. What may be a limiting principle, however, is the price. And of course, you're looking at $349 for the prime lens. You're looking at closer to $900 for the zoom lens. So I recognize that not all of you have a budget that extends to the $900 range. If you do, and you're interested in something more than just the 20 millimeter focal length, having a little bit more of a zoom, this is an attractive option. If you are put off by the barrel distortion here and your budget extends only kind of to this prime range, you might also consider looking at the Tamron 24mm F2.8 because it gives you a lot of the similar strengths, but the barrel distortion is much milder and much easier to manage. Not really a major factor there. So at the end of the day, once again, we've got choices, for which I am very thankful. I wish that barrel distortion wasn't so prominent because in many, many ways, this is a fantastic little prime lens. At the end of the day, you'll have to make a decision yourself whether you can live with its potentially fatal flaw. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. Lots of samples and citations there, photos to look at, so check that out. There's also linkage there to my image gallery, and so you can look at photos and again make a determination for yourself whether or not the lens works for you. And outside of that, there is buying links if you would like to purchase. There's also linkage there to follow me on social media, to become a patron, or to sign up for my newsletter. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.